Crossing the Wire: The Story of Kim Sung-min. Chapter 1: Lights Beyond the Fence. April rain drummed against the concrete walls of the guard post. As Lieutenant Kim Sung-min peered through the narrow observation slit, 650 meters away, across the heavily fortified demilitarized zone, the lights of a South Korean guard post flickered like distant stars in the darkness, a sight that had begun to haunt his dreams with increasing frequency. Sung-min had been stationed at this remote outpost for 3 years, serving as a political security department officer, responsible for monitoring 40 soldiers. At 28, chronic hunger and the weight of surveillance had carved deep lines into his gaunt face. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea demanded unwavering loyalty, but loyalty became harder to maintain when your stomach cramped with emptiness and your family slowly withered from malnutrition. His informant network of 9 agents was failing not through disloyalty, but through starvation. They were too hungry to think clearly, too weak to venture far, too desperate to care about anything beyond their next meal. When they managed to produce reports, the intelligence was laughably inadequate. The lights are very bright on the South Korean side. Or, we heard music playing from their compound. Standing at his post one evening, something compelled Sung-min to withdraw a small South Korean flashlight salvaged from propaganda leaflet drops. These items were supposed to be destroyed immediately, but like many soldiers, he had secretly collected them. The South Korean lighter lasted months without refueling. Unlike crude North Korean equivalents that barely functioned, acting on impulse, Sung-min pointed the flashlight toward the South Korean position and clicked it twice. His heart hammered as he waited. Then, impossibly, 2 quick flashes winked back from across the divide. Someone had seen his signal and responded. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the vast ideological chasm collapsed into simple human acknowledgement. Over the following weeks, this ritual became the highlight of Sung-min's existence. Each evening, when darkness provided cover, he would signal across the divide. The response always came, sometimes immediately, sometimes after minutes. But it always came. He began creating simple patterns that were dutifully echoed back. The contrast between the two sides became impossible to ignore. South Korean soldiers moved with casual confidence, appearing well-fed with intact uniforms and excellent equipment. Sometimes laughter or music drifted across sounds that had become foreign to his austere existence. Meanwhile, his own men grew thinner and more desperate. 2 soldiers had already attempted desertion, caught before reaching the fence line. Their punishment was swift and brutal. The leaflet drops continued regularly, carrying tantalizing glimpses of life in the South. USB drives with dramas and K-pop, solar radios, vitamin supplements, instant noodles, and small electronics. Officially, these were psychological warfare tools. Unofficially, they represented a lifeline to an impossibly prosperous world. One evening, as he prepared for another signal exchange, Sung-min allowed himself to imagine crossing that invisible line. What would it feel like to eat until satisfied? To speak freely, without fear? To pursue personal interests without ideological conformity? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying, treasonous and punishable by death for himself and potentially his family. But continuing to serve a system slowly, killing everyone he cared about seemed equally unbearable. As Sung-min flashed his signal that night, he made a silent promise. He would find a way to learn more about the world beyond the fence, whatever the cost. The person responding to his signals had opened a door in his mind that could never be closed. Chapter 2: The Reality of Hunger. The next morning brought harsh reality as Sung-min faced managing his informant network. The 9 men and women were Asari, sight gaunt figures who shuffled rather than walked, hollow-eyed, with chronic malnutrition, clothes hanging on skeletal frames. Park Hyun-soo, his most reliable informant and former mathematics teacher, could barely concentrate long enough to compile coherent reports. When they met at their rendezvous point, an abandoned farm building, Park's hands shook visibly as he attempted to write on a scrap of paper. "Comrade Lieutenant," Park whispered nervously, "I must speak honestly. My family hasn't eaten properly in 4 days. My wife has begun selling her hair for cornmeal, and my children." His voice trailed off. Sung-min withdrew a small plastic bag containing cooked Rice his own breakfast, saved for this purpose. Park's eyes lit up with desperate gratitude as he consumed it with his bare hands. "The lights, Comrade Lieutenant," Park reported. "Every night, they burn so brightly. It must require tremendous resources. And yesterday, I observed recreational activities, soldiers playing some ball game. This was the extent of available intelligence. Observations about lighting and recreation. By professional espionage standards, such reports were worthless. But in North Korea's surveillance state, even innocent observations carried dangerous implications. Any positive comment about South Korean conditions could be interpreted as ideological wavering. Each informant told similar stories: physical deterioration, family hardship, intelligence reports revealing more about their desperate circumstances than enemy activities. Sung-min found himself sharing his own rations to keep the network functioning, a forbidden but necessary practice. The irony wasn't lost on him that he, a political security department officer tasked with ensuring loyalty, was witnessing firsthand the state's failure to provide for its people. The contrast between official propaganda claiming North Korea was a prosperous paradise and his daily experience of struggle for basic necessities had become impossible to ignore. His own situation was marginally better but deteriorating. Military rations, once reliable enough to ensure basic nutrition for security personnel, had become increasingly scarce. Promised deliveries frequently failed to materialize, leaving entire units to forage for wild plants and hunt small animals. The psychological toll was enormous. Sung-min found himself constantly preoccupied with thoughts of food, not exotic delicacies, but simple, filling meals providing enough energy to get through each day. He dreamed of rice bowls filled to the brim, of substantial meat dishes, of fresh rather than wilted vegetables. During one particularly difficult week when no supplies arrived for 6 days, Sung-min made an unthinkable decision. He secretly consumed South Korean instant noodles from a leaflet drop. The taste was revelatory, rich, savory, and satisfying in ways North Korean food hadn't been for years. The noodles provided more nutrition than he typically received. In several days, this experience crystallized a growing realization. The enemy's psychological warfare was devastatingly effective, not because of ideological content but material superiority. South Korean goods falling from the sky were tangible proof of a society that could afford to give away high-quality products as propaganda tools. By contrast, North Korea could barely provide basic necessities to its own security personnel. When compiling his weekly intelligence summary, Sung-min found himself reporting his informant's observations about South Korean prosperity, while pretending they represented nothing more than enemy deception tactics. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting, requiring him to maintain contradictory beliefs simultaneously. His report was a masterpiece of bureaucratic double-speak. Enemy forces continue displaying material goods as part of psychological operations, designed to create false impressions of prosperity. Informants observed continued propaganda activities, including lighting systems and recreational facilities. Counterintelligence measures remain effective in preventing ideological contamination among loyal citizens, but hunger was reality that couldn't be bureaucratized away. As Sung-min locked his report and prepared for surveillance duties, his stomach cramped with emptiness. Across the DMZ, South Korean positions glowed with steady light, a nightly reminder of possibilities, both tantalizingly close and impossibly distant. Chapter 3: Family Obligations and Breaking Point. 3 months after his first signal exchange, Sung-min received leave to visit his family. The journey required 2 days of travel by military truck, bus, and finally on foot along roads deteriorated beyond vehicle capability. His childhood home was in a rural area, once considered relatively prosperous by North Korean standards. His father had been a factory supervisor before his death 5 years earlier, providing modest but reliable access to food and necessities. Without his father's connections and status, the family's circumstances had declined rapidly. Sung-min's mother, Kim Sun-hee, was 54, but looked decades older. When he arrived at their small house, 3 rooms with clay brick walls and corrugated metal roof, he was shocked by her appearance. She moved slowly and hesitantly, hands extended as she navigated familiar spaces. "Mother, what happened to your eyes?" Sungmin asked, grasping her thin, frail hands. "The doctor says it's caused by poor nutrition," she replied with a weak smile. "The vitamins that preserve sight are found in foods we can no longer afford. But don't worry, I manage well enough by touch and memory." His sister Minji, now 18 but appearing no more than 14 due to severe malnutrition, had been born during the 1990s famine years. Her growth was permanently stunted by chronic hunger. Her small hands bore frostbite scars from gathering edible plants along the frozen riverbank. "Oppa," she said, using the affectionate term for older brother, "when you leave again, what will happen to us?" The house had deteriorated significantly. The roof leaked in multiple places, forcing his family to arrange pots and buckets to catch rainwater. The floor had dangerous holes where wooden supports had rotted. Windows were covered with plastic sheeting because glass was broken and couldn't be replaced. Sungmin calculated repair costs nearly 70,000 won, more than his official salary for several months, even with black market exchange rates, making South Korean goods artificially expensive. This represented an enormous sum for a family without reliable income. Violating every regulation governing military personnel, Sungmin decided to borrow money from his soldiers to repair his family's house and provide survival supplies. Military units often operated informal lending systems, with officers borrowing from enlisted men who had accumulated small amounts through various activities, working alongside grateful local laborers. Sungmin spent his remaining leave installing a new roof, repairing the floor, and sealing walls against wind and rain. The physical labor was exhausting, but satisfying, the first truly meaningful work in months. When time came to return to his post, his mother and sister wept openly. Minji pressed the 70,000 won into his hands, somehow scraped together from unimaginable sources. "You cannot continue sacrificing yourself for us," she said through tears. "If you're discovered helping us, you'll be punished. And then what happens to any of us?" His extended absence hadn't gone unnoticed. Upon return, Sungmin was summoned before Colonel Park Chil-sung, whose reputation for ruthlessness was well established. The interrogation lasted hours, with Park probing for evidence of unauthorized activities or ideological deviation. Eventually, Park seemed satisfied that the absence was motivated by family obligations rather than political dissent. "Lieutenant Kim, you will be placed on administrative probation for 6 months. Any additional disciplinary issues will result in reduction in rank and possible reassignment to a punishment unit." Sungmin's position had become precarious in ways extending beyond career concerns. The Political Security Department didn't tolerate even minor deviations from expected behavior. His extended leave had marked him as potentially unreliable, a designation with potentially fatal consequences if other activities were discovered. That night, resuming surveillance duties and preparing for another signal exchange, Sungmin reflected on impossible choices defining his existence. He could serve the state faithfully and watch his family die, or help his family and risk punishment that would leave them more vulnerable. There seemed no path leading to anything resembling a good outcome. The final catalyst came with Private Jang Hyoksun, a 20-year-old caught trading military supplies for food. The offense was relatively minor, ammunition for rice, but punishment was swift and severe. Sungmin was ordered to conduct the investigation and ensure appropriate punishment, requiring him to participate actively in destroying a young man whose only crime was trying to survive. During interrogation, Private Jang broke down completely, describing his family's desperate circumstances. His father had died in a mining accident, leaving his mother and 3 siblings without support. The traded rations were intended to prevent family starvation, not for personal enrichment. "Please, Comrade Lieutenant," Jang pleaded. "I know what I did was wrong, but my family will die without help. My youngest brother is only 6 years old. What else could I do?" Sungmin looked into the face of desperation, while being required to respond with bureaucratic indifference. Regulations were clear: trading military supplies was theft from the people, punishable by minimum 5 years in labor camp. Circumstances motivating the crime were irrelevant to punishment determination. 3 days later, Private Jiang was transferred for court-martial proceedings. Through unofficial channels, Sungmin learned the young soldier received 7 years in a political prison camp. His family was evicted and relocated to a remote collective farm, where survival would be even more difficult. The incident forced Sungmin to confront his own role in perpetuating the system's cruelty. He wasn't simply a victim of circumstances beyond control, he was an active participant in machinery of oppression, destroying lives for the crime of seeking basic survival. Around this time, his nightly signal exchanges had become more elaborate and personal. Simple light flashes had evolved into complex patterns, seeming to carry emotional weight. Sometimes responses came immediately, as if his correspondent waited eagerly for contact. Other times long delays were followed by rapid sequences, conveying urgency or excitement. Sungmin began imagining the person across the fence as a kindred spirit, someone understanding the loneliness and frustration of border duty, finding comfort in secret communication with an unknown counterpart. The unknown soldier had become more real and important than most people in his daily life. One rainy night in early April, providing excellent cover for clandestine activities, Sungmin crossed a line from which there could be no return. He composed a brief message in Korean, wrapped it around a small stone, and threw it toward the South Korean position. I am Lieutenant Kim Sungmin of the Korean People's Army. I wish to know more about your life and your country. The audacity was breathtaking. Physical messages across the DMZ constituted espionage activities punishable by death, even if never found or dismissed as provocation. The mere act represented fundamental betrayal of his oath as a security officer. For 3 nights, he waited anxiously for any sign. The message was received. On the 4th night, his signal exchange included a new pattern: 5 short flashes, followed by 3 long ones, repeated several times. He interpreted this as acknowledgement of his message. Someone across the fence knew his name and rank. Someone had responded in a way suggesting understanding and acceptance of forbidden communication. The convergence of pressures, professional, personal, psychological, created a perfect storm of desperation and opportunity. Sungmin realized he was approaching a decision point that would determine his life's trajectory. He could continue serving a system systematically destroying him and everyone he cared about, or take the ultimate risk and attempt crossing to the other side. When he received word that Private Jiang had died in custody, officially from illness, more likely from brutal conditions, a young man who had committed no crime other than loving his family had been murdered by the system Sungmin served. The knowledge that he had participated in this killing by conducting the investigation filled him with rage and self-loathing. That night, he flashed his final signal to the South Korean position: long, slow pulses conveying farewell and gratitude. The response came immediately, with the same pattern repeated back in understanding and acknowledgement. Sungmin returned to his quarters and began final preparations for an escape attempt that would either lead to freedom or death. Either outcome seemed preferable to continuing his current existence. The lights across the DMZ beckoned like a promise of redemption. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe a better life might be possible. Chapter 4: The Crossing. On April 28, 2008, conditions were as favorable as Sungmin could hope. Steady rain had been falling since early evening, creating low visibility and causing electrical systems along the fence line to malfunction intermittently. His duty roster placed him on perimeter patrol from midnight to 400 a.m., providing legitimate explanation for his presence. In the border area, he had studied guard rotations and sensor placements for weeks, identifying a narrow window lasting no more than 20 minutes. During shift changes, certain fence sections were monitored only by electronic sensors, and rain had already caused several false alarms that would help mask his movement. His personal effects were arranged to suggest normal sleep patterns: clothing laid out for the next day, personal items in usual places, a partially written letter to his mother on his desk. If his absence wasn't discovered until morning roll call, he would have several hours lead time before search operations could be organized. His minimal escape kit included wire cutters salvaged from maintenance supplies, medical tape for binding potential injuries, a knife, and what little food he could carry without arousing suspicion. He wore dark civilian clothing under his uniform, which he planned to discard once clear of the immediate area. At 1:15 a.m., Sungmin made his way to the predetermined fence section, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid triggering motion sensors. Rain was falling heavily enough to reduce visibility to less than 30 meters, perfect for concealment, but dangerous for navigation through unfamiliar terrain. The first fence was easiest to breach. This outer perimeter was designed primarily to channel potential infiltrators toward monitored crossing points, rather than prevent all unauthorized passage. Sungmin had identified a section where natural drainage created a small depression, allowing him to squeeze underneath without cutting wire. The second fence presented greater challenges. This barrier carried electrical current, though rain had caused multiple system failures throughout the night. Using an insulated tool, he tested several sections, until finding one where power had been interrupted by moisture infiltration. Working quickly but carefully, he cut an opening just large enough for passage. The minefield lay between second and third fence lines, approximately 50 meters, that had claimed numerous would-be escapees' lives over the years. However, Sungmin's engineering background taught him that mine placement followed predictable patterns. Based on drainage and soil conditions, water naturally followed the path of least resistance, and military engineers typically avoided placing anti-personnel mines in flood-prone areas. Following a small watercourse meandering through the minefield, Sungmin moved with painstaking care. Each step required careful probing with a thin metal rod to test for buried explosives. The process was agonizingly slow, and precious minutes slipped away as he navigated the deadly maze. 25 meters into the minefield, his probe struck something metallic. Sungmin froze, heart hammering as he carefully traced the outline of what appeared to be an anti-personnel mine. The device was old, possibly from the original DMZ construction, and heavy rain had exposed part of its casing. Working with infinite care, he marked its position with cloth and found an alternate route around the hazard. The remainder of the crossing took 43 minutes, far longer than anticipated. By the time he reached the third fence line, Sungmin was exhausted, soaked through, and beginning to worry his absence might have been discovered. This final barrier was most formidable: triple-strand concertina wire topped with razor ribbon, motion sensors every 20 meters, and regular patrol routes, bringing guards within sight every 15 minutes. His watch showed 2:18 a.m. as he approached the final obstacle. The next patrol was due at 2:25, giving exactly 7 minutes to breach the fence and reach concealment on the other side. Using wire cutters, he worked frantically to create an opening in the lower strand, ignoring barbs tearing at his hands and arms. As he squeezed through the gap, a motion sensor activated, flooding the area with harsh white light. Sungmin threw himself flat against muddy ground, praying rain would be blamed for another false alarm. For 30 seconds that felt like hours, light swept back and forth across the fence line before automatically shutting off. Now he was in the narrow strip of no man's land separating North Korean fortifications from their South Korean counterparts. This area was perhaps the most dangerous part of the entire crossing, open ground under observation from both sides, patrolled irregularly by forces from both armies, subject to immediate and lethal response to any unauthorized activity. After what seemed like an eternity of crawling through darkness, his outstretched hand encountered wire fencing. But was this the South Korean perimeter, or had he become disoriented and circled back toward his own lines? In the darkness and rain, it was impossible to tell. He had no choice but to continue forward. The South Korean fence proved differently constructed, higher, with more sophisticated sensors, but apparently not electrified. As Sungmin began cutting through outer wire, he was startled by sudden activation of powerful searchlights, illuminating the entire area in brilliant white light. This time there was no question of false alarms. He had been detected by South Korean surveillance systems, and armed soldiers would be responding within minutes. Abandoning all attempts at stealth, Sungmin stood upright in the searchlight glare and began waving a white cloth he had prepared. In his limited English, he shouted words he had practiced countless times: "I am defector." I am defector. Do not shoot. From behind a concrete barrier approximately 50 meters away, a voice called out in accented Korean, "Stay where you are. Put your hands above your head and do not move." The first South Korean soldier to reach him was a sergeant in his early 30s, wearing full combat gear and carrying an assault rifle at ready position. His uniform was immaculate despite weather conditions, and his equipment appeared much higher quality than anything Sungmin had seen in the North Korean military. "What is your name and unit?" the sergeant asked in perfect Korean. "I am Lieutenant Kim Sungmin, Political Security Department, Korean People's Army," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I request political asylum in the Republic of Korea." Additional soldiers had arrived during this exchange, creating a defensive perimeter while maintaining weapons trained on Sungmin. Their discipline and professionalism were immediately apparent. Well-trained, well-equipped troops operating according to established procedures rather than reacting with panic. Within minutes, additional personnel arrived, including intelligence officers and medical personnel. The efficiency of their response was impressive, suggesting defector incidents were handled according to well-rehearsed protocols. "Lieutenant Kim, you will be taken to a secure facility for medical evaluation." In debriefing, the sergeant informed him, "You will be treated according to international law and Republic of Korea policies." Regarding North Korean refugees, "Do you understand?" "Yes, I understand. Thank you for not shooting me," Sungmin replied with profound relief. As he was led toward waiting vehicles, Sungmin turned for one last look at the North Korean positions he had abandoned. In the distance, emergency lights were beginning to activate as his absence was discovered and search operations commenced. By morning, every unit in the region would be mobilized to hunt for him, not knowing their quarry had already crossed into a different world entirely, unlike anything Sungmin had ever seen. Chapter 6: Love, Loss, and Redemption. As Sungmin settled into his new life, the loneliness of his situation became increasingly apparent. Most South Koreans were friendly but distant, treating him with polite curiosity rather than genuine warmth. The language barrier was more significant than initially realized. Decades of separation had created differences in vocabulary and cultural references that marked him as a foreigner. This social isolation was partially alleviated when Sungmin met Young Mi-young at a community center Korean language class designed to help defectors improve their South Korean communication skills. Mi-young was not a defector but a volunteer teacher who had been working with North Korean refugees for several years. At 32, Mi-young was a librarian at a Seoul university who devoted weekends to volunteer work. Her approach to teaching was patient and encouraging, and she seemed genuinely interested in Sungmin's background, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated respect for his experiences, rather than mere curiosity. Over months of language classes, their friendship gradually deepened into romantic attraction. Their relationship progressed slowly, with early dates consisting of walks in parks, museum visits, and quiet dinners, where they could talk freely about hopes and concerns. "Sometimes I feel guilty about being happy here, when I know my family is still suffering," Sungmin confided. "How can I enjoy a movie or nice meal when my mother is probably eating grass soup?" "Your suffering in solidarity wouldn't help your family," Mi-young pointed out gently. "But your success here might eventually create opportunities to help them." After a year of courtship, they married in a small ceremony attended by her family and friends from the defector support community. Mi-young's parents had initially been apprehensive about their daughter marrying a North Korean defector, but came to appreciate his character and unique perspectives. When their son Kim Ji-hoon was born, Sungmin was overwhelmed with emotions he hadn't anticipated. The prospect of becoming a father in a free society, of raising a child who would never know hunger or fear or political oppression, seemed like the ultimate vindication of his decision to escape. However, the responsibilities of parenthood highlighted the continuing strain of separation from his original family. He found himself wondering whether his mother was still alive, whether she would ever meet her grandson, whether his sister had survived the harsh conditions deteriorating when he left. The marriage began experiencing strain. as Sungmin struggled with depression and anxiety related to unresolved grief about his family situation. He had never received proper counseling for trauma, and the psychological burden of survivor's guilt was affecting his ability to fully embrace his new life. The tension reached a breaking point when Ji-hoon was 19 months old. Sungmin's drinking had increased as a coping mechanism, and his behavior had become erratic. One evening, after consuming several beers, while watching news about North Korea, he became agitated and began shouting about guilt and frustration. "I married you because I believed you could build a new life here," Mi-young said through tears. "But you're still living in North Korea emotionally, and there's no room in that world for Ji-hoon and me." The separation became permanent when Sungmin's response to the crisis was to increase his drinking rather than seek professional help. The divorce was conducted with sadness rather than anger, as both recognized their fundamental problem was not lack of love, but incompatible demands of Sungmin's past trauma and their shared future aspirations. The end of his marriage represented a devastating personal failure that sent Sungmin into a downward spiral of depression and self-destructive behavior. His work performance suffered, social connections withered, and drinking escalated to dangerous levels. The crisis culminated one evening when, after consuming a large quantity of alcohol while dwelling on failures and losses, Sungmin fell from the 7th floor of his apartment building. The catastrophic injuries required months of medical treatment and rehabilitation. When he regained consciousness in the intensive care unit, his first coherent thought was about his son. Ji-hoon needed a father, regardless of how damaged that father might be. The long road to physical recovery provided time to seek the professional psychological help he had avoided. Survivor's guilt is a common response to traumatic experiences. Drive. Lee explained during therapy sessions. You feel guilty for escaping when others couldn't, guilty for finding happiness when your family is suffering. These feelings are understandable, but they're not rational, and they're not helpful to anyone. His relationship with Ji-hoon became the focal point of recovery and primary motivation for building a meaningful life. The boy was old enough to ask questions about his father's background, and sharing appropriate parts of his story helped both understand their family history and shared values. During recovery, Sungmin received visitors from the North Korean defector community, who provided emotional support and practical assistance. These relationships, neglected during his marriage and depression, proved crucial to his healing. You're not the first person to struggle with these issues, explained Kim Tae-hyun, a defector who had become involved in human rights advocacy. Many of us go through periods of depression and guilt. The key is to find ways to channel those feelings into positive action. As his physical condition improved, Sungmin began considering how he might use his unique background to help others understand North Korean reality. His position as a former political security department officer provided insights into the regime's methods that few other defectors could offer. He began giving informal talks to church groups and university classes, sharing experiences and answering questions about life in North Korea. These speaking engagements gradually evolved into a more formal role as a human rights advocate and analyst. Most South Koreans have some idea that conditions are bad in North Korea, Sungmin explained to audiences, but they don't understand how completely the system controls every aspect of life. It's not just political oppression, it's the systematic destruction of human dignity and individual choice. This work gradually provided him with sense of purpose and meaning that had been missing since his divorce. His combination of insider knowledge, analytical skills, and personal credibility made him an effective spokesperson for North Korean human rights issues. 3 years after his accident, Sungmin had established himself as one of South Korea's most credible advocates for North Korean human rights. He had also rebuilt his relationship with his son into something stronger than it had been during his marriage. Ji-hoon, now 8 years old, was developing into a confident, compassionate child who took pride in his father's work. His story had become more than a personal narrative of escape and recovery. It had become a testament to the possibility of transformation and redemption. Even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, the lights that had beckoned him across the DMZ so many years earlier had led not just to personal freedom, but to opportunities to help others find their own paths to hope and dignity. Epilogue: a message of hope. 10 years have passed since Lieutenant Kim Sung-min made his desperate crossing of the demilitarized zone. Today, as he stands before an audience of international diplomats and human rights advocates in Geneva, his transformation from desperate refugee to respected analyst represents more than personal success. It embodies the possibility of hope in even